On the evening of November 8th, 1983, a 16-year-old boy in Fairfax County, Virginia, tuned his shortwave radio to 7.8 megahertz and heard something that would unravel a Soviet intelligence operation that had been running successfully for nearly 8 years. The transmission lasted exactly 4 minutes and 17 seconds. A woman's voice, mechanical and emotionless, read groups of numbers in English: 063, 291, 447. The cadence was precise, the intervals between number groups identical, and the whole thing had the quality of something designed not to be noticed unless you were specifically listening for it. The boy's name was David Brennan, and he had been an amateur radio enthusiast since his 12th birthday, when his father, a telecommunications engineer at Bell Atlantic, had given him a used realistic DX300 receiver and a wire antenna that they'd strung between the house and a oak tree in the backyard. What David didn't know that evening, sitting in his bedroom with headphones on and a notebook in his lap, was that the transmission he'd just heard was coming from less than 300 feet away, from the basement of a modest split-level house on the same cul-de-sac where his family had lived for the past 6 years. And he definitely didn't know that the man who lived in that house, a quiet technical writer named Thomas Reichert, was actually Yuri Mikhailovich Sokolov, a KGB officer who had been operating under deep cover in the United States since the spring of 1976. Fairfax County in 1983 was everything the American suburbs were supposed to be: tree-lined streets where kids rode bikes until the streetlights came on, station wagons in driveways, PTA meetings, and Little League games, and block parties on the 4th of July. The neighborhoods that sprawled west from Washington, D.C., were filled with federal employees, military contractors, engineers, and middle managers who commuted into the city each morning and returned each evening to houses that all looked vaguely similar, distinguished mainly by the color of their shutters and the state of their lawns. It was exactly the kind of place where a Soviet intelligence officer could disappear into the background, and that was precisely the point. The Cold War in 1983 was at a particularly tense moment. Ronald Reagan had been president for nearly 3 years, and his administration's rhetoric toward the Soviet Union had grown increasingly confrontational. The Strategic Defense Initiative, quickly nicknamed Star Wars by the press, had been announced that March. NATO was preparing to deploy Pershing-II missiles in Western Europe. The Soviet Union had shot down Korean Airlines Flight 007 in September, killing all 269 people aboard, including a U.S. congressman. And on both sides of the Iron Curtain, intelligence agencies were operating with a level of paranoia and aggression that hadn't been seen since the worst days of the 1950s. David Brennan had discovered shortwave radio the way a lot of teenage boys in that era discovered their obsessions, through a combination of boredom, curiosity, and the particular kind of focus that comes from being just intelligent enough to find school unchallenging, but not quite confident enough to excel socially. He was a sophomore at James Madison High School, got mostly B's without trying particularly hard, played JV soccer because his parents thought he needed to be involved in something, and spent most of his free time in his room with the door closed, either reading science fiction novels or scanning the radio dial. The shortwave bands in 1983 were crowded with signals. International broadcasters like the BBC World Service, Radio Moscow, Voice of America, and Deutsche Welle competed for listeners across multiple frequencies. Amateur radio operators, ham operators as they called themselves, chatted back and forth about weather and equipment. Utility stations, the unsexy but essential communication systems that kept ships and aircraft and remote installations connected, filled the spectrum with data bursts and teletype signals. And then there were the strange ones, the number stations. David had first encountered them about 6 months earlier, sometime in late April or early May. He'd been scanning through the 5 megahertz band when he'd stumbled across a transmission that stopped him cold. A male voice, speaking in what sounded like Spanish, reading 5-digit number groups with mechanical precision. The transmission went on for about 10 minutes, then cut off abruptly, leaving only static. David had sat there for a moment, trying to figure out what he'd just heard. It didn't sound like a regular broadcast. There was no music, no announcer identifying the station, no advertisements or programming content of any kind, just numbers. He started keeping notes after that, recording frequencies and times whenever he found something unusual. He checked out books from the library about radio propagation and signal analysis. He discovered that there was a small community of shortwave listeners, people who monitored the airwaves as a hobby, and some of them were particularly interested in these mysterious number broadcasts. The general consensus, passed around in newsletters and amateur publications, was that these were coded messages being sent to spies. The idea seemed both thrilling and absurd to David. Spies were something from movies and paperback thrillers, not something that existed in Fairfax County, Virginia, where the biggest crime in recent memory had been someone stealing lawn furniture from the McCarthy's backyard. But the more he listened, the more convinced he became that these transmissions were real, that somewhere on the other end of these broadcasts were people receiving instructions from intelligence agencies halfway around the world. He started developing a routine. He'd come home from school, do enough homework to keep his parents from asking questions, eat dinner with his family, and then retreat to his room around 7:30 or 8. He'd turn on the receiver, put on his headphones, and start scanning. Some evenings he'd find nothing interesting. Other nights he'd stumble across a numbers station, and he'd scramble to grab his notebook and record everything he could. The frequency, the time, the language being used, the format of the numbers, any identifying sounds or signals that preceded the transmission. On November 8, 1983, David had been scanning the 7 megahertz band for about 20 minutes when he found the signal at 7.8. It was a strong signal, much stronger than most of the international broadcasts he usually heard. He could tell immediately that it was local, or at least relatively close by, because the signal strength was too high and too stable to be bouncing off the ionosphere from some distant transmitter. The transmission began with a brief musical phrase, just 4 notes repeated twice. Then the woman's voice started reading numbers. 063 291 447. The voice was clearly synthetic, generated by some kind of speech device rather than an actual person, but it was well articulated, easy to understand. David wrote down the first several number groups, then stopped and just listened. There was something about this particular transmission that felt different from the others he'd heard. It was too clean, too professional, and the signal strength bothered him. If this was coming from Eastern Europe or Latin America or wherever these stations typically broadcast from, the signal shouldn't be this strong and this clear on his relatively modest receiver setup. He waited until the transmission ended, marked down the time in his notebook, and then did something he'd never done before. He turned on his father's directional antenna, a piece of equipment they'd installed the previous summer to improve reception of distant stations, and began slowly rotating it, watching the signal strength meter on his receiver. The directional antenna was a simple but effective tool. It was basically a loop of wire mounted on a rotating base, and by turning it and watching how the signal strength changed, you could get a rough idea of what direction a transmission was coming from. As David rotated the antenna, he watched the signal strength indicator rise and fall. When the antenna pointed roughly northwest toward downtown DC and beyond, the signal dropped. When he rotated it to point east toward Chesapeake Bay, it dropped further. But when the antenna pointed south roughly toward the other houses on his street, the signal peaked. David sat there, staring at the meter, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The strongest signal was coming from somewhere very close. Not miles away, not even blocks away, somewhere in his own neighborhood. He told himself he was wrong, that he'd made a mistake, that the directional antenna wasn't precise enough to draw that kind of conclusion. He spent the next hour running tests, tuning to known stations, and checking to make sure the antenna was working correctly. Everything checked out. When he tuned back to 7.8 megahertz, the transmission was gone, the frequency silent except for the usual background noise of shortwave static and distant interference. Over the next several weeks, David became obsessed with finding that transmission again. He monitored 7.8 megahertz every evening, sometimes for hours at a time, waiting to hear that brief musical introduction and the synthetic voice reading number groups. He started keeping more detailed notes, not just about the transmission, but about his entire neighborhood. He made a rough map of his street, noting which houses had outdoor antennas, which ones had suspicious-looking vehicles parked in their driveways, anything that might indicate unusual activity. His parents began to worry. His grades, which had never been stellar, started slipping. His mother asked if everything was okay at school, if he was having trouble with friends or teachers. His father, who understood the appeal of radio more than his mother did, asked if he wanted to upgrade his equipment, maybe get a better receiver or build a more sophisticated antenna system. David said no to everything, insisting he was fine, that school was fine, that he was just working on a project. On December 2, 1983, at exactly 8:47 in the evening, the transmission appeared again. David had been scanning the band when he heard the four-note musical phrase, and he immediately grabbed his notebook and started recording. The transmission lasted 4 minutes and 12 seconds this time, slightly shorter than the first one he'd heard. Same synthetic female voice, same precise cadence, same format of 5-digit number groups. When it ended, David turned on the directional antenna and began rotating it slowly. The signal peaked when the antenna pointed south, just as it had before. But this time, David went further. He marked the exact position of the antenna, then pulled out the neighborhood map he'd been working on. The antenna was pointing almost directly at 3 houses. The Kowalskis, an elderly Polish couple who'd lived on the street for decades. The Hendersons, a family with 4 kids who were always outside making noise. And Thomas Reichert's house. David thought about what he knew about each family. The Kowalskis were in their 70s, both retired, both visible members of the community, who attended Mass every Sunday and hosted elaborate Easter dinners. The Hendersons were chaos incarnate, the kind of family that seemed incapable of doing anything quietly or discreetly. Thomas Reichert, on the other hand, was a mystery. He'd moved into the neighborhood about 5 years earlier, David thought, maybe 1978 or early 19. He lived alone, drove a beige Toyota sedan, worked as a technical writer for some company whose name David had never bothered to remember. He was friendly in a distant sort of way, the kind of neighbor who would wave if you saw him outside but never stop to chat. David's parents had tried to invite him to a barbecue once, shortly after he moved in, but Reichert had politely declined, claiming he had work commitments. As far as David knew, Reichert had never had visitors, never threw parties, never did anything to draw attention to himself. The next morning, a Saturday, David rode his bike past Reichert's house, trying to look casual, trying to see if there was anything visible that might confirm or refute his growing suspicion. The house looked ordinary. A modest split level with brown siding and white trim, a small front yard that was neatly maintained but not obsessively so, a detached garage with the door closed. There was nothing obviously unusual, no massive radio tower, no suspicious equipment visible through the windows. But then David noticed something he'd never paid attention to before. On the side of the house, partially obscured by a hedge, was what looked like a television antenna. Except it wasn't pointing toward the nearest broadcast towers in DC, which most TV antennas in the area did. It was pointing south, angled toward the ground rather than the sky. David circled the block twice, trying to get a better look without being obvious, and each time he passed Reichert's house, the antenna bothered him more. It didn't look like a TV antenna at all when you really examined it. It looked like a long wire antenna, the kind used for shortwave transmission. He went home and spent the rest of the day in his room, reading everything he could find about radio transmission, trying to understand how someone might set up a clandestine broadcasting station. What he learned was both reassuring and terrifying. Reassuring because it was technically possible to broadcast on shortwave frequencies using relatively simple equipment that could fit in a basement or spare bedroom. Terrifying because if someone was doing that from a residential neighborhood, and if they were broadcasting coded messages, the implications were obvious. On December 6th, David made a decision that would change everything. He called the FBI. The call itself was awkward from the start. David dialed the number for the Washington field office, which he'd found in the phone book, and asked to speak to someone about suspicious radio transmissions. The receptionist transferred him to someone in the General Crimes Division, who listened to his story with what sounded like polite skepticism, then transferred him to someone else, who asked a series of questions that made David realize how thin his evidence actually was. Yes, he'd heard unusual transmissions. Yes, he believed they were coming from his neighborhood. No, he couldn't prove they were connected to espionage or any illegal activity. No, he hadn't seen anyone doing anything suspicious beyond having an antenna that didn't look quite right. The agent, whose name was Collins or Connors or something similar, told David that they would look into it, but that he shouldn't expect immediate action based solely on radio signals that could have any number of innocent explanations. Amateur radio operators broadcast all the time, the agent explained. Private companies use shortwave for internal communications. Even government agencies had legitimate reasons to transmit on those frequencies. David hung up feeling frustrated and slightly embarrassed, convinced that he'd sounded like a paranoid kid with too much time on his hands and too much imagination. What David didn't know was that his call had been taken more seriously than Agent Connors had let on. The FBI in 1983 was deeply invested in counterintelligence operations, and the Washington field office had a dedicated team that did nothing but track Soviet intelligence activities in the D.C. area. When Connors filed his report about the call from the teenager in Fairfax County, it made its way to the desk of Special Agent Marion Wheeler, a counterintelligence specialist who had been with the Bureau for 18 years and who had spent most of that time dealing with Soviet espionage cases. Wheeler read the report, made a note of the address David had mentioned, Thomas Reichert's address, and ran it through the FBI's database systems. What came back was interesting. Thomas Reichert had a completely clean record. No arrests, no suspicious activity, no red flags of any kind. But when Wheeler pulled his employment history and cross-referenced it with known Soviet intelligence patterns, something stood out. Reichert had worked for 5 different defense contractors over the past 7 years, all of them companies that handled classified government contracts, all of them in positions that gave him access to technical documentation and facility layouts. He never stayed at any one company long enough to trigger security reviews that might have flagged the pattern, and his personnel files showed him to be competent but unremarkable, the kind of employee who did his work adequately and then went home without forming close relationships with colleagues. The FBI opened a preliminary investigation on December 9th. They began with surveillance, assigning a rotating team of agents to monitor Reichert's movements. What they observed over the next 3 weeks confirmed Wheeler's instincts. Reichert maintained a routine that was almost suspiciously regular. He left for work each morning at 7:30, drove to his current employer's office in Reston, returned home each evening between 5:45 and 6:15, and rarely left the house after that except for occasional grocery shopping trips or errands. He had no visitors. He made no phone calls from his home line that raised any flags. He attended no meetings, no social gatherings, no events that would put him in contact with known or suspected Soviet intelligence officers. But the absence of obvious contact was itself suspicious. Soviet illegals, deep-cover officers operating without diplomatic protection, were trained to avoid any direct connection with their handlers. They used dead drops, signal sites, and one-way communication methods like shortwave radio transmissions to receive instructions and pass information. If Reichert was an illegal, and if he was using radio to communicate with Moscow, catching him would require patience and technical expertise. On December 28, 1983, the FBI made the decision to install technical surveillance equipment in the house adjacent to Reichert's property. The neighbors, a couple in their 50s, named Gerald and Doris Patterson, were approached by FBI agents who explained, in carefully controlled terms, that they were conducting a national security investigation and needed to use the Pattersons' house for monitoring purposes. The Pattersons agreed, both out of patriotic duty and because the FBI made it clear that refusing would look suspicious. Over the course of 2 days, while Reichert was at work, FBI technical specialists installed listening devices in the common wall between the two houses and set up radio monitoring equipment in the Pattersons' basement. The goal was to intercept any transmissions originating from Reichert's house and to overhear any conversations that might reveal his true identity or purpose. For the first 2 weeks, the surveillance produced nothing. The listening devices picked up the normal sounds of someone living alone in a house, television noise, the occasional phone ringing, with no conversation that seemed important, the routine sounds of daily life. The radio monitoring equipment detected nothing on 7.8 megahertz or any other frequency. Then on January 11th, 1984, at 9:22 in the evening, the monitors detected a transmission, not on 7.8 megahertz, but on 14.7 in the 20-meter amateur band. The transmission was brief, less than 2 minutes, and consisted of a series of rapid Morse code bursts that the FBI's analysts would later determine were encrypted data transmissions. The signal originated from Reichert's house. There was no question about it. The monitoring equipment triangulated it precisely to his basement. 2 days later, on January 13th, another transmission occurred, this time on 10.5 megahertz. And then on January 17th, another on 7.8, the same frequency David Brennan had first noticed back in November. The FBI now had confirmation that Reichert was operating a radio transmitter from his residence, and the patterns of transmission, combined with the encrypted nature of the signals, were consistent with intelligence communications. But confirmation of illegal radio transmissions wasn't enough to make an espionage case. The FBI needed evidence that Reichert was a Soviet agent, that the transmissions were going to Moscow or to Soviet handlers, and that the content of those transmissions involved classified information or intelligence-gathering activities. Special Agent Marion Wheeler convened a meeting of the investigative team on January 20th to discuss next steps. The consensus was that they needed to get inside Reichert's house to see what equipment he was using and to search for any documents or materials that might prove his connection to Soviet intelligence. But getting a warrant for a search based solely on unauthorized radio transmissions was difficult. They needed more evidence, or they needed to catch him in the act of doing something that clearly crossed the line into espionage. The solution came from an unexpected source. On January 24th, 1984, David Brennan called the FBI again. This time, he asked specifically for Agent Connors, and when he couldn't reach him, he left a detailed message explaining that he'd heard another transmission on the same frequency, that he'd confirmed using his directional antenna that it was coming from the same location, and that he'd noticed something new. Thomas Reichert had begun parking his car in the driveway rather than in the garage, and when David had ridden his bike past the house earlier that evening, he'd seen light coming from the basement windows, light that flickered in a way that suggested someone was moving around down there with a flashlight rather than turning on the regular basement lights. Agent Wheeler received David's message the next morning and made the decision to bring the teenager in for a formal interview. On January 27th, David and his father sat in a conference room at the FBI's Washington field office while Wheeler and another agent asked David to walk through everything he'd observed. David brought his notebooks, his frequency logs, his maps of the neighborhood, everything he'd compiled over the past 3 months. Wheeler was impressed by the boy's attention to detail and by the systematic way he'd approached the problem. More importantly, David's observations about Reichert's recent behavior, the change in parking habits, the unusual use of lights in the basement, suggested that Reichert might be preparing for something. Wheeler explained to David and his father, in carefully vague terms, that the FBI was investigating the matter and that David's information had been helpful. Then Wheeler did something that would later be debated within the Bureau. He asked David if he would be willing to help with the investigation in a limited capacity. The role would be simple and low risk. David would continue monitoring the radio frequencies as he'd been doing, but he would report any transmissions immediately to the FBI rather than waiting. And if he observed anything unusual about Reichert's house or activities, he would document it and report that as well. David's father was initially reluctant, worried about putting his son in any kind of danger, but Wheeler assured him that David would never be in direct contact with the subject, that he would simply be providing information that the FBI could use to coordinate their surveillance efforts. David agreed, partly because he was 16 and the idea of working with the FBI seemed impossibly exciting, partly because he'd already invested so much time and energy into understanding these transmissions that walking away now felt impossible. For the next 3 weeks, David became an unofficial auxiliary to the FBI's investigation. He monitored the radio frequencies every evening, and whenever he detected a transmission on 7.8 or 10.5 or 14.7 megahertz, he immediately called a dedicated phone number the FBI had given him, a direct line to the surveillance team. The FBI used David's alerts to coordinate their own monitoring equipment, confirming transmissions and recording them for analysis. On February 15, 1984, the investigation reached its critical phase. The FBI's technical analysts had finally broken the encryption on some of Reichert's transmissions, not completely, but enough to determine that they were sending encoded information to a receiving station that was almost certainly located in the Soviet Union. The content appeared to be technical data, specifications and diagrams related to defense systems, exactly the kind of information that Soviet intelligence would pay a premium to obtain. Combined with Reichert's employment history and his pattern of moving between contractors with access to classified projects, the case for espionage was becoming undeniable. On February 22, federal prosecutors authorized an arrest warrant and a search warrant for Thomas Reichert's residence. The FBI decided to execute the warrants early in the morning, before Reichert left for work, to maximize the chance of catching him with evidence that he couldn't destroy. At 6:15 a.m., on February 23, 1984, a team of 12 FBI agents approached the house on David Brennan Street. Some went to the front door, others positioned themselves at the back and sides of the property to prevent escape. When Reichert answered the door, still in his bathrobe and clearly surprised, the agents identified themselves, informed him that he was under arrest for espionage-related offenses, and began searching the house. What they found in the basement confirmed everything: a sophisticated radio transmitter, a Heathkit SB-104 modified for greater power output, connected to an antenna system that ran through the walls and emerged on the side of the house disguised as a TV aerial, a cryptography system, manual one-time pads consisting of pages of random number groups that could be used to encode and decode messages, a 35mm camera, and several rolls of undeveloped film, documents, some of them bearing classification markings from defense contractors Reichert had worked for, others appearing to be technical notes and diagrams that Reichert had created himself based on information he'd accessed through his various positions. In a false bottom drawer in his bedroom, agents found a Soviet passport under the name Yuri Mikhailovich Sokolov, along with emergency contact procedures and instructions for exfiltration if his cover was compromised. Thomas Reichert, or rather Yuri Sokolov, did not resist arrest. According to the agents present, he seemed almost relieved, as if the burden of maintaining his cover for nearly 8 years had finally become too heavy to carry. He was transported to the FBI's field office, where he underwent interrogation that would last for several days. What emerged from those interrogations was a profile of a Soviet intelligence operation that had been remarkably successful until a 16-year-old with a shortwave radio happened to notice something unusual. Sokolov had been recruited by the KGB in 1973 while working as an electrical engineer in Moscow. He'd undergone 3 years of intensive training, learning English, studying American culture, memorizing the details of Thomas Reichert's fabricated life history. The real Thomas Reichert had died in a car accident in 1971 at the age of 26, and Soviet intelligence had obtained his birth certificate and other identity documents through methods that Sokolov claimed not to know. He'd entered the United States through Canada in 1976, established residency in Maryland, and gradually built up his legend, his cover identity, working low-level technical positions until he had enough credentials to apply for jobs with defense contractors. His mission had been straightforward: gather technical intelligence on American defense systems, transmit that information back to Moscow via shortwave radio, and maintain his cover for as long as possible. He'd been told to expect a deployment of at least 10 years, possibly longer. The radio transmissions that David had detected were part of a scheduled communication protocol. Sokolov would encode messages using his one-time pads, then transmit them on prearranged frequencies at specific times. The transmissions David had heard with the synthetic female voice reading number groups were not Sokolov's outgoing messages, but incoming transmissions from Moscow, instructions and confirmations sent to Sokolov using a number station operated by the KGB. Sokolov would listen to these broadcasts, write down the number groups, and then decode them using his one-time pads to receive his instructions. The system was elegant in its security. Even if someone intercepted the transmissions, even if someone recorded every number group, the messages were mathematically impossible to decrypt without the one-time pad, and the pads themselves were disposable, each page used once and then destroyed, leaving no pattern for cryptanalysts to exploit. What Sokolov hadn't counted on was that the strength of his radio transmissions, combined with a curious teenager who happened to have the right equipment and the right mindset to notice something unusual, would lead to his undoing. The trial of Yuri Sokolov began in October 1984 in the United States District Court for the Eastern District of Virginia. The case was built on the evidence found in his house, his own eventual confession, and the testimony of FBI agents who had conducted the surveillance and made the arrest. David Brennan was not called to testify. The FBI and prosecutors made the decision to keep his involvement as limited as possible, both to protect him and because his role, while important in initiating the investigation, was not essential to proving the charges. Sokolov was charged with conspiracy to commit espionage, unauthorized possession and transmission of classified documents, and operating an unregistered radio transmitter for illegal purposes. He pleaded guilty to all charges in November 1984, and in January 1985, he was sentenced to 35 years in federal prison. The question of whether Sokolov would be traded for an American intelligence officer held by the Soviets was raised during sentencing, but no trade ever materialized. He would serve his full sentence, minus time for good behavior, and would eventually be released in 2009, by which time the Soviet Union no longer existed and the Cold War was a historical period rather than a present reality. David Brennan's life returned to something approximating normal after the arrest, though normal now included occasional visits from FBI agents who thanked him for his assistance and reminded him that the details of the investigation were classified and shouldn't be discussed. His grades improved slightly, though he never became an exceptional student. He graduated from high school in 1985, attended Virginia Tech, and eventually became an electrical engineer working for a telecommunications company in Northern Virginia. He stayed interested in radio throughout his life, maintaining an amateur radio license and occasionally participating in contests and DX expeditions. But he never spoke publicly about his role in the Sokolov case, honoring the FBI's request that he keep quiet about his involvement. The house where Yuri Sokolov had lived, where he'd operated his clandestine radio station and transmitted classified information to Moscow for nearly 8 years, was sold to a new family in 19. They renovated the basement, tore out the radio equipment that the FBI had left behind after documenting it, and turned the space into a rec room with a pool table and a big screen TV. The neighborhood moved on, as suburbs do, with new families arriving and old ones leaving, with kids growing up and moving away, with the rhythms of ordinary life continuing regardless of whatever secrets might have been hidden beneath the surface. The Cold War ended 5 years later, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, followed by the collapse of the Soviet Union itself in 1991. The intelligence operations that had defined the conflict, the networks of agents, and the systems of communication, and the thousands of people on both sides who had spent their careers in the shadows, gradually became subjects for historians rather than active concerns for counterintelligence services. But the lessons from cases like Sokolov's remained relevant. The case demonstrated that even the most carefully constructed cover could be penetrated, that even the most secure communication systems could be detected if someone was paying attention in the right way at the right time. For the FBI's counterintelligence division, the Sokolov case became a teaching example, used in training sessions to illustrate the importance of technical surveillance and the value of information from unexpected sources. The fact that a teenager with a shortwave radio had been the catalyst for breaking the case was both embarrassing and instructive. It suggested that intelligence agencies, for all their sophisticated equipment and trained personnel, sometimes missed things that ordinary people noticed simply because they were curious or obsessive or happened to be in the right place at the right moment. In the years since 1984, the story of David Brennan and Yuri Sokolov has occasionally surfaced in books about Cold War espionage and in FBI training materials, though usually with names changed and details obscured to protect the identities of those involved. The basic narrative remains the same. A Soviet agent operating under deep cover in a Washington suburb used shortwave radio to communicate with Moscow. A teenage radio enthusiast detected those transmissions, reported them to the FBI, and helped initiate an investigation that led to the agent's arrest and conviction. But the full story, the one that includes all the details of David's obsessive monitoring of the shortwave bands, the precise technical specifications of Sokolov's equipment, the mundane routine of suburban life that provided the perfect cover for espionage, remains largely untold. What makes the case significant isn't just that an illegal was caught or that a source of intelligence leakage was shut down. What makes it significant is that it demonstrates the nature of intelligence work during the Cold War, how it was carried out not in exotic locations or dramatic confrontations, but in ordinary places by people who looked and acted like everyone else around them. Yuri Sokolov was successful for nearly 8 years, not because he was a master of disguise or because he had access to cutting-edge technology, but because he was patient and disciplined and unremarkable. He blended into suburban Virginia so completely that his neighbors barely noticed him, and that anonymity was his greatest asset. His downfall came not from a sophisticated counterintelligence operation or a technological breakthrough, but from the simple fact that a curious kid with a radio happened to be scanning the right frequency at the right time and refused to dismiss what he'd heard as insignificant. In the vast machinery of Cold War espionage, with its satellites and supercomputers and armies of professional intelligence officers, one teenage amateur radio operator's attention to detail achieved what years of systematic surveillance might have missed. And somewhere in the FBI's classified archives, in a file marked with case numbers and security classifications, is a record of those November and December nights in 1983 when David Brennan sat in his bedroom with headphones on, listening to the static and signals of the shortwave bands, not knowing that he was hearing the voice of the Cold War itself, transmitted from a basement less than 300 feet away.